little bit slow, but it's coming. I just didn't want to cut off the should be alive now. Okay. Okay. Come on, peep. Okay. Should come up. Ah, come on, come on. Okay. Here we are. I'm sorry for all this. As I was telling everybody else, I am operating with a very old computer. So welcome to this art size salon. Hello. Okay, welcome to this art size salon on March 15. There you go. Okay, so my name is Roberta Buiani, and I am the art director of the Art Size Salon at the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences, which is hosting us tonight. Now we are welcoming Eben Kirksey, who is joining us from Melbourne, Australia, and for him is March 16. So before introducing you to tonight's guest and to our fabulous respondents, I would like to make a few acknowledgements, and I would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nation, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the dish with one spoon, one belt covenant, and which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe, and allied nations who peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community and on this territory. And although we are doing everything online these days, I think I have my feet standing right now deeply planted into this land, and this needs to be acknowledged. And I'm sure that no matter where you're joining me from, you are well aware of it and this moment. So I'm just gonna stop sharing here so we can look into each other's eyes. So I would like to ask you for a couple of favors. So first, please make sure that your video and audio are off during the presentation so that I can easily pin the guests. Then feel free to use the chat, which some people have already started, and ask questions at any time. We will go back and read them later. There's like 3-4 people who are helping me tonight, so I really hope we can get everything done. When we talk, when the talk is over and during our discussion time, you can raise your hand. Use the chat or send me questions to my UofT mail, which was in the registration mail that you received. And finally, I ask that everybody be civilized, but I know that you are, so like I don't think this is an issue. So the Mutant Project. Tonight we are featuring a talk and discussion with Eben Kirksey, followed by a discussion by our discussion and respondent people, Elizabeth Koester, Vincent Auffrey, and Zhang. And I will first introduce Dr. Kirksey, then after the talk I will introduce the discussant. All right, so this talk is titled The Mutant Project, or at least it's inspired by the Mutant Project. I just wanted to say something about it because I finished reading it, and I actually have some of the books, these 2 books that I read and that accompany me for some time. I find the Mutant Project a fascinating and a very entertaining book. Also entertaining, yes. It is an ethnography exploring the scientific history and the adventures that led to the sensational and controversial announcement of the birth of Lulu and Nana, the first CRISPR babies. And I really enjoyed the balanced way in which Eben explained the events and the type of pressures and politics and the difficulties that make such sensational scientific breakthroughs. And it's important to remember this. And as a lecturer at the University of Toronto at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, or IHPST for friends, I teach a course titled Optimizing Life, which looks at the many ways in which we use biotech, machine learning, and a bit of artistry to modify human and non-human life. So I decided to assign 3 chapters of Eben's book to my students, and then I thought that I would invite him to my class. But then as we talked about the impossible time zone differences, we decided that why not? We should just do this public. And I think that everybody is glad for this because the discussion will be much richer and also more insightful in this way because we have a much more diverse audience. So I just want to read a couple of lines from the book, from the introduction to the book that I received. At a conference in Hong Kong in November 2018, Dr. Jiankui announced, sorry for the bad pronunciation in Chinese, announced that he had created the first genetically modified babies, 2 girls named Lulu and Nana, sending shockwaves around the world. A year later, a Chinese court sentenced Dr. He to 3 years in prison for illegal medical practice. And as scientists elsewhere start to catch up with China's vast genetic research program, gene editing is fueling an innovation economy that threatens to widen racial and economic inequality. Fundamental questions about science, health, and social justice are at stake. Who gets access to gene editing technology? As countries loosen regulations around the world, from the US to Indonesia, can we shape research agendas to promote an ethical and fair society? So I think that we have enough questions, but I'm pretty sure that Eben has more. So without further ado, Eben. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Roberta, and thanks to this group for gathering. Sort of in honor of this being the Arts Science Salon, what I've tried to do today is tease out some of the key roles that particular artworks have played in this project. I'm also going to give you a broad introduction to some of the key sort of ideas and what CRISPR is to give you some background for the discussion. So are the slides showing up on your end? Can you see them? So as Roberta said in the intro, the story of Dr. He Jiankui is kind of central to the book and kind of opens the story. I'm there in a hotel in Hong Kong, along with many other experts who've assembled around the world for the second Human Genome Editing Summit. And we really anticipated that it would be much like the first. Basically, we'd all gathered a few years earlier in Washington, D.C., and this is really where the story starts. The first Human Genome Editing Summit wasn't a major international media spectacle. It was, a bunch of really diverse thinkers, artists, makers, activists, rubbing shoulders with members of Congress, with members of the MITRE Corporation, a company that's heavily invested in national security applications like technology, as well as members of the White House, sort of came together under the National Academies of Science Rotunda here in Washington. Some of you might recognize the picture of the guy in the bottom of this sort of photoshopped mashup. This is the artist Adam Zaretsky, and it's kind of his fault that I wrote the book. At the time, I was teaching in Princeton. I just released Emergent Ecologies, and I was kind of looking around for what my next project might be. And Adam told me that this summit was happening, so we decided to go to Washington together. And it very much felt like, at times, scenes from an X-Men movie. That we're talking about these things from the realms of science fiction. And Adam is taking things said from the main stage and amplifying them and distorting them in some surprising and uncanny kinds of ways. So you had straight-laced scientists at this summit, like Robin Lovell Badge, the person who later chaired the discussion with Dr. He in Hong Kong a few years later. So at this first summit, Lovell Badge is telling the public, there's certain kinds of things that we can do with these tools like CRISPR to change how humans look. It would be relatively trivial, Lovell Badge insists, to create green glowing people. We've known how to insert a gene called GFP into all kinds of organisms for decades now. The iconic artwork GFP Bunny by Eduardo Kac, in the year 2000 showed that this is possible. We share the same biology with rabbits. We could make green glowing children. Adam is sort of listening to those kinds of things and also coming up with his own proposals for creating, in his mind, a genetically modified child as a work of art. There's a lot of ways that Adam is really trying to push bounds of ethical discourse. I think at that point, in my mind, if this technology was rolled out by an established company like, say Novartis or Editas, one of these highly moneyed enterprises, I think the rollout would have looked quite different than the scene that erupted in Hong Kong with this announcement from Dr. He. But at that particular moment, as Adam was making these pronouncements about splicing centipede genes into human babies, about creating plaid and Technicolor kids, inviting people to think about extra toes as something they might consider for their children as a new kind of genetic fashion. He in some ways is lampooning the scientific establishment. He's showing what's possible, at moments insisting that science is doing more effective surrealistic art than art itself. But at the same time, I think all of Adam's work might be seen as an attempt to really encourage people who encounter his shock art to slow down and reflect about where these technologies are heading. So this is an artist rendering of what CRISPR looks like on a molecular scale. You might have heard about the editing metaphor. So Jennifer Doudna and others who are pioneering uses of CRISPR technologies have suggested that gene editing is way more precise and efficient than technologies that came before. In my book, I look at other tools like zinc fingers that are much less well known. The editing metaphor actually doesn't originate with CRISPR, it originates with zinc fingers, which has been in the clinic for at least a decade before this experiment broke from Hong Kong. Basically, these molecules do the same thing. They grab a hold of the DNA double helix, they produce what's called a double-stranded break, and then they rely on the cell to repair the damage. In my mind, it's less editing than something else. There's a lot of different metaphors that others have applied. Gene surgery implies that a slip of the surgeon's scalpel can create unintended genetic damage. Genetic engineering emphasizes the continuity between CRISPR and earlier tools. In my book, I use the Reaper drone as an example of a different way of thinking about how this tool induces targeted damage. So the drone basically is given coordinates. You can target a terrorist, and sometimes it hits that target, but very often there's collateral damage. So sometimes you unintentionally take out the wedding party. And sometimes the coordinates are off. Sometimes it hits an unintended target. So CRISPR sometimes is really good at hitting a targeted region of DNA and creating that damage. But sometimes it hits other parts of the genome. And really, in absence of a perfect metaphor, I think technical language describes it best. CRISPR creates targeted mutagenesis. In other words, CRISPR creates mutants. And this, in part, is where the title of the book comes from, the Mutant Project. I'm trying to think not about the neat, clean efficiency of editing, but how this targeted damage can go wrong in surprising ways. So already at the time of Dr. Hu's experiment, we knew that when you're creating this targeted damage, maybe you'll take out a single letter when the DNA is stitched back together by the cell. Maybe you're taking out 3 or 4 or 5 letters. Sometimes thousands of kilobases of DNA go missing when you create this targeted damage. And recent papers suggest that you might unintentionally take out a whole chromosome when you're trying to just delete a single gene. The gene that Dr. Hu targeted is called CCR5. And in many ways, he was building on a robust history of science targeting this gene. So the book describes some HIV positive activists with the collective ACT UP who had CCR5 taken out of their white blood cells nearly a decade before Dr. Hu's experiment. So in short, you give the CRISPR, or in the HIV patients, the adults, you give it coordinates. So it was zinc fingers in the earlier experiment, CRISPR with Dr. Hu's experiment. You just tell the missile to go hit this target, and hopefully it hits the right target. When you kind of go back and look at each cell where this is done, there's very idiosyncratic patterns of damage. So when this was done in adults 10 years before Dr. Hu's experiment, this was done on the order of billions of times. So we have around 34 trillion cells in an adult human body. This experiment done by the company Sangamo with zinc fingers basically took all these white blood cells out of these HIV activists' bodies. They broke the gene, or at least tried to, but in many cases you don't get both the chromosomes, you only get one chromosome. And even in those cases where you did get the chromosome, you're not entirely sure what you got. In Dr. Hu's case, in some ways, it was much more controlled. It was done, he did an injection at the single cell stage, and then again after the first cell division, and then went back and sequenced these embryos and made decisions about which to implant. The book describes some poor decisions that he made, and he also was very much influenced by the desires and hopes of the parents. There were moments of intense conflict between the lab and the patients, where the patients wanted more than one pregnancy at once. Dr. Hu wasn't a doctor, and in fact, he was charged with illegal medical practice. That was the statute that the Chinese authorities brought to bear on this case. And he also wasn't a specialist in reproductive medicine. He has a PhD in biophysics. He had some people with clinical experience on his team, but one of the core mistakes that the team made was basically implanting multiple embryos at the same time. So the book describes how Dr. He seriously misled the world. He made an announcement on YouTube while we were all gathering in this hotel in Hong Kong, claiming that 2 babies had just been born, as healthy as any others. The book goes into details of their premature birth at 31 weeks. They had difficulty breathing. There wasn't a photo op. Dr. He wanted a photo op. And in fact, the participant consent form explicitly granted him permission to take a picture at the moment of birth and to have the rights to put that on billboards, on buses, on elevators. All this was spelled out in the agreement with the patients. But the babies were being kept in the neonatal intensive care unit. And in fact, one of them was still in the neonatal intensive care unit when those videos were posted on YouTube and the news broke from Hong Kong. It's only now, a couple years later, as my book is out, that this story is being told for the first time about the health problems. This is the university campus where Dr. He conducted the experiment. Many allege that he was China's Frankenstein, that he was working in secret, but my book chronicles the ways that he was supported by his university, by the president of the university, by local members of the Communist Party, officials in Beijing, as well as party officials in a province called Hainan. There he was working with international investors to set up a new international center for CRISPR medicine. So his idea was to gather together a team of 100 doctors to train researchers and clinicians from around the world and offer CRISPR in reproductive medicine to medical tourists from around the world. This is a scene from the hospital that gave Dr. He ethics approval for this experiment. One of the key hospital administrators told the Associated Press, as the news was breaking, that the experiment was, quote, ethical. Later, the hospital denied any involvement, but I went there and basically the story checked out. The Associated Press has images taken from here. But this is not where the experiment was done. It was actually much more complicated. It was a series of hospitals involved in the procedure. This is a scene from that same hospital that illustrates some of the potential eugenic futures that we might be facing if this is the milieu that rolls out CRISPR germline genome editing. Germline genome editing basically just means you're editing these cells, and here I'm slipping back into the metaphors I don't like, right? Editing. But the germline is basically the cells that give rise to the whole organism and also the future of that particular population. The germline goes on to become sperm and eggs, so you're going to pass on any genetic changes to your offspring. So if it rolls out here, this is a hospital that has a plastic surgery clinic. So here is a doctor showing off some of the examples of patients that she's treated and who've given their consent to have their images publicly displayed. So basically, this is a clinic that specializes in skin lightening treatments, Asian eyelid removal, other kinds of procedures that are actively remaking race, that inherit colonial ideals about beauty that spread after the Korean War, when plastic surgery was first rolled out by US doctors, and a so-called act of beneficence against their, towards their translators to remove the so-called sleepy Asian eye. So, the ideals about beauty that are embedded in a place like this, the legacies of eugenics, a term that really means good genes when you get at the root of it, eugenics. These are all, a danger here in this particular environment. The book also talks about not just about CRISPR and the brave new techno futures to come, but how in a place like this, existing technologies, not just plastic surgery technologies, but genetic technologies, are having profound eugenic consequences in the here and now. I discuss prenatal testing techniques that are expanding the category of so-called defective baby. So in the 1980s, when amniocentesis was first developed, only women of advanced maternal age, so-called high-risk pregnancies, were encouraged to have an invasive prenatal test that would give them some kind of genetic diagnosis about their babies. Now it's being expanded in basically all mothers in China, in the US, in places like Australia and Europe. They're all being encouraged to take these blood tests, and these blood tests are expanding again that category of abnormal baby. So, you know, the technology of CRISPR and the existing technologies that are in the clinic really have the risk of homogenizing human species. So one of the questions I open up in the book is, do we want to all dream the same dreams and aspire towards the same futures? Can CRISPR be used to engender new kinds of biological diversity into the population rather than homogenize the species? The book also spends some time dealing with the very complicated social and sexual lives of the couples who signed up for this experiment. In China, having HIV comes with profound stigma. And Dr. He recruited patients on WeChat, which is basically a platform very similar to Facebook or Messenger that is kind of one of the dominant forms of staying in touch in China. And specifically, he used a WeChat group called Baihua Lin, which is composed of largely gay and bisexual men who are navigating very complicated epistemologies of the closet. So in China, not only is HIV something that is profoundly stigmatizing, like if your boss finds out that you're HIV positive, you're likely to lose your job, you're unlikely to find a marriage partner if your romantic partner knows your status. But you know, being entangled in a heteronormative relationship in China also carries profound stigma. So, you know, I was trying to be attuned to these complicated social lives and sexual lives of gay and bisexual men who found themselves entangled in the dreams of others, entangled in dreams about reproductive futures that were only partially their own. So in China, you know, at a certain point, the rhetoric about baby making was not just one child, but must have one child. So many of these men and their wives were experiencing a lot of pressure from the older generation to have children. And, you know, I'm kind of thinking about this in tension with Donna Haraway's insistence on making Ken not babies. You know, clearly in contemporary Chinese society, that mantra has a very different ring. So, you know, Haraway in her latest book, Staying with the Trouble, is writing about the contemporary population problem. So on the one hand, you know, in a place that has experienced profound restrictions on reproductive freedom, you know, this slogan of Haraway's doesn't really match up with the social reality. So on the one hand, I was trying to grapple with these simple dreams in some ways for a healthy child. The parents signed up basically because it was the only legal mechanism that they had to make babies. So in China, if you are HIV positive, you cannot get access to IVF, in vitro fertilization, a technique that basically reduces the chance of transmitting HIV to your baby or your partner to zero. The book goes into, you know, complicated histories of science. Now we know that if you stay on your medication, if you're using highly active antiretroviral drugs, you can make a baby the old-fashioned way if you're HIV positive. So if your viral load is undetectable, that's untransmittable. And that's become, just in the last few years, the new mantra of public health discourse in the HIV space. But it wasn't known at the time of Dr. He's experiment. So some of the participants were upper and middle class members of the Chinese Communist Party, members of the military who could not travel because they needed special permission. So if you're gay, if you're HIV positive, you can do reproductive tourism to places like the US or places like Thailand. But if you're an active duty member of the military, you can't get that permission without coming up with a good reason of justifying this travel to your boss. Others simply couldn't afford this kind of international reproductive tourism. So within China, I visit a lot of IVF clinics. I even visited some black market IVF clinics. On the hospital wall, on the bathroom wall of the hospital that actually did this this experiment with Dr. He, I found written in marker, the WeChat address of a black market clinic. And I talked to them and basically learned that if I happened to be HIV positive, I couldn't avail myself of the services even on the black market in China. So in many ways, this high-powered techno fix that Dr. He was imagining to HIV was really trying to address a social problem, not an unmet medical need, but really an unmet social need. So Haraway's thinking is aside from that one particular issue related to make kin, not babies, Haraway's thinking is profoundly influential in my own ethnographic work related to genetic engineering and CRISPR technologies. With her Cyborg Manifesto of 1985, she's already calling on people to make not only subversive engagements with computers. In those days, the personal computer was a specter of terror to many feminist thinkers. And the Cyborg Manifesto was really an invitation to think with these emergent technologies and the sorts of appropriations and misappropriations we might make. Haraway, as the last chapter explores, very much has influenced also the ways that we might enter into dialogue with speculative fictions, to think not just about the homogenizing danger of these technologies, but the potential to do different things with the human population. So one of the other artists, and I'd like to end on this particular project that I dialogue with in the book, is a transgender performance artist from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. This is Tamara Pertamina, pictured here, with a project that she rolled out a few months before the scandal with Dr. He broke. Basically, she took a food cart from a local street vendor and gave it a makeover, creating the CRISPR sperm bank, inviting local people in Yogyakarta to imagine trans-species possibilities. So this sperm bank is being rolled out in the context of a local medical landscape that's totally deregulated. So for example, the transgender community doesn't really have access to the sorts of surgeries or hormone therapies that one might access in the US or Thailand. Some well-heeled members of the transgender community are able to go abroad for these procedures, but most of them are doing DIY body modification at home. This is also an environment, on the way from the airport to Tamara's house in an urban shanty town. I passed, a number of advertisements for all sorts of either illicit or sort of untested technologies. There were herbal treatments that promised sexual potency. There were treatments that promised to make you taller. This is in a regulatory space where it's sort of fast and loose and anything goes. So with this CRISPR sperm bank, Tamara Pertamina was trying to create a dialogue with the international hacker community, with the international biotech community, about what sorts of dreams we might imagine. Tamara is known locally for her performance art that is about bringing attention to ideas of race and beauty, similar to what I was talking about in the plastic surgery clinic that I encountered in China. One of Tamara's other performances involves painting her face white, a very common beauty practice in Indonesia, where other Asians sort of look down their noses at darker skinned peoples, but then also painting her body black. So in Indonesia, there's a genocide going on. My first book is about West Papua, a place where you're more likely to get shot or stopped by the police simply based on the color of your skin. So in the context of this ongoing racial violence, the ongoing genocide in Indonesia, the ongoing lived experience of people from Southeast Asia, lived experience of discrimination vis-a-vis lighter-skinned people from East Asia, vis-a-vis Europeans and Americans, what counts as beautiful here is very much influenced by these hegemonic colonial ideals. Tamara was taking the sperm bank around and asking people, do you want a child with blue eyes? That's a relatively easy gene to change. It's I believe a single A to a T. So it's like blue eyes or not blue eyes. Do you want a child with big muscles? You can knock out a gene called myostatin. Would you like a condition called tetrachromacy, which would enable you to see millions of new colors that other people cannot see? So in many ways, this project represents to me, what the future of gene editing might look like in different kinds of spaces that are outside of the standard medical establishment, where a lot of these tools are getting tested out. So I just wanted to, sort of end there, open it up for questions. Again, thanks Roberta for hosting today, and I'm really looking forward to what everyone wants to know about in dialogue with the book.
Hey, thanks so much for this. We have, so before we start the questions from the audience, because I know that people will have a lot of questions, I can imagine. I asked some of my colleagues and some graduate students from the program to come and make commentaries and ask questions first, so that we get started, right? And we have three people. Elizabeth Koester, Fan Zhang, and I don't see Vincent. Where is Vincent? Oh, and Vincent Auffrey was here. And Elizabeth teaches a course on the history of eugenics. I think Vincent is the aim for her, and he's also interested in history of eugenics as a scholar. And Fan has a very diverse series of interests, and is interested in archaeology, I understand. So I don't know who wants to start. Elizabeth, you want to start?
I'd be happy to start. Thank you so much for your talk, Eben. That was really, really fascinating. And I would just like to put the book up and say it's just fabulous. Everybody should run right out and read it. It's really, really interesting and very entertaining. And Roberta, the timing for this could not be more perfect, because the course that Vincent and I work on is called Eugenics and Contemporary Issues. And the last week, which is 2 weeks from now, we get into all the CRISPR technology. So I see that some of our students are here tonight, so you'll have a head start on all these really interesting issues. So as you can sort of see in that little blurb that came out with the meeting notes, I'm a historian. And historians are often reluctant to comment on how our work of delving into the past can inform the present. And it's not true of all historians, but we often tend to believe that, there's an inherent value in studying the past on its own terms for its own sake, and that we don't really have to answer the question, so what does that tell us about today? And I think I have avoided questions in the past myself by saying, oh, sorry, I just look at the past, I don't look at the future. But as a historian of medicine and eugenics in particular, I must say that this question is coming up more and more often, and we see the word eugenics kind of tossed around in the media, and lots of different examples. And so it's made me reflect about whether or not, my work as a historian in the history of eugenics can engage with certain contemporary issues that are related to the way we live and the choices that we make, and where we might see eugenic thinking coming up. So I was really interested to see how you used the history of eugenics in your book to kind of trace some of the past, but also kind of look forward and see some of the kind of eugenic, what we could characterize as eugenics, in the decisions that we're making going forward. And that got me thinking about the issue of kind of academic silos as well, and the problem of just working in one field and not connecting and not talking. And I was also very interested in your book, in the way you used fiction and movies and Donna Haraway's work to elucidate your points. And I heard an interview about a week ago on the radio with Kazuo Ishiguro, the Nobel Prize winner, who writes the fiction about issues that are very similar to the ones that are raised by the work in your book. And he talked about the role of creative imagination and scientific imagination, and how these different kind of areas can inform our thinking about what it is to be human. So I just thought that it really comes together very neatly in your book, sort of thinking about our course and about the comments that I heard on the radio. So that was just an observation that I would like to start with. And I do now have a question. I'm sure that everybody will have the really big questions to ask you about the role of the tension between the development of science and the commercialization of that scientific development. So I'll let other people ask those questions. And I'd like to start off on a slightly different tack and ask you what you thought you'd find at the beginning of your investigation of this, and whether or not it changed or confirmed or surprised you, sort of from what the original project was like.
So yeah, thank you for all of that. I think your comment sums up in part what I was trying to do, which is account for a history of the present and histories of the future, and think about the imagination as a battlefield, in the words of Ruha Benjamin, where competing visions of the future are selectively brought into contact with reality, and chronicling the power dynamics, the power of regulatory bodies, the power of capital to sort of bring certain futures closer to the present. Let's see, and your question, it was so rich. It's
Really,
early morning here too.
oh yeah, really, I just was, as a historian, you start off with kind of what are my historical questions and what are
How did it change? How did it
and
change?
how it changed over the course, because your book, what really struck me, I know only a little bit about this topic, but it is so complex. And at one point, it was interesting, you said that you started off quite critical of Dr. He, and then you became more sympathetic. And I wondered, in that must have happened a lot as you worked through this, or maybe it didn't. So I thought it would be interesting to hear what kind of where you started and where you ended.
It did indeed. And I think, I started out very skeptical of the whole project, right? So, page back to 2015, we had the huge promise of genomics with the Bill Clinton announcement in 2000. Like, here's the draft of the human genome. We're going to unlock all these medical promises. 15 years later, it was all hope and hype. When I started this project, I thought it was a story about, speculation in the biosciences that was never going to come into contact in reality. Over the course of the project, not only did the first gene therapies get rolled out, and I sort of find myself in the lab and in Philadelphia, walking through the Cancer Survivor Hall of Fame, learning the stories of the young children who put their bodies on the line for a Novartis drug that now costs $400,000. So the hope and the hype have turned into product, and the product has exacerbated all kinds of medical inequality. So I thought it was going to be a simple project of like, there's not a there, but the there emerged. And then I also, in conversation with these HIV positive activists, kind of learned to love the bomb, kind of in the earlier idiom, right? So these people who had watched their partners die in the 1980s and early 1990s, who have been campaigning for risky and innovative experimental approaches to HIV research ever since the days of AZT. Back in the day, there was the one drug, it had horrible side effects, it didn't work, and they wanted new risky adventures and biomedical enterprise to kind of fill that gap. So, people like Matt Sharp, Jay Johnson, who I profile in the book, really convinced me that there was a there, and that there was worth fighting for, and that the struggle was no longer just about getting a technology that would work, but getting a technology that would be affordable and that wouldn't reproduce inequalities of race and class inherited from previous legacies. With Dr. Ha's story, I went through various periods of like empathizing with the guy and just feeling like he did some serious ethical misconduct. And, from the summit in Hong Kong, I could see that Orientalism was playing out. So back to science fiction, an early British colonial novel, Dr. Fu Manchu, talks about the evil Asian genius who steals Western knowledge and threatens the downfall of civilization. And you see that stereotype repeat time and time again, with the cyberpunk fiction of the 1990s, with the sprawl described by Neil Stevenson, where cyborgs and menacing Asians with implants and drug lords who are also underground gene dealers, mix and mingle with these terrifying specters of a techno future. And Blade Runner that has these gritty scenes of the underground labs. So on the one hand, I saw my task as unmasking some of those Orientalist stereotypes that play out in techno fiction. Shenzhen, the city that gets described as Blade Runner throwing up on itself, like that's Mike Daisey, this gonzo American journalist on This American Life, debuts with This American Life's This American Life is already a popular podcast, but this was the single most popular podcast at the single most popular episode, but it was retracted a few weeks later for factual errors, making claims about child laborers that didn't stand up. But really what I found that didn't stand up were the stereotypes about this place. Shenzhen doesn't look like Blade Runner threw up on itself. It looks like San Diego, but with a lot bigger buildings. These colorful sculptures, like every night, there are, light shows on the buildings, but it's not these kind of menacing holograms of a product placement strategy, but it's kind of a beautiful, playful, sort of sunset fireworks show that happens every evening. So I think, trying to get the place right, but then it wasn't until I was almost done with writing this book that my trusted interlocutors in the lab opened up about the big story, which is that these babies were very sick at birth. This was not known until I published this book. And that made me think very differently about this man. So this man who I'd struggled to understand in terms of the China dream, someone who aspired to study abroad and got admitted to Rice and was in a key Silicon Valley lab in Stanford. I really tried to understand his story in his own terms, but as I came to learn of this profound misleading statement, not only to the scientific, it's not mentioned in the manuscript that he submits to Nature that gets rejected, the fact that they were born 31 weeks. And it's really not like that YouTube video is totally misleading. So that led me to reevaluate and just, I do think he was scapegoated by an international community where there's a lot of people pushing in the same direction. But yeah, he also has some serious ethical missteps that he needs to account for.
Thanks. I'm happy to turn it back to you, Roberta. I have many other.
Oh, okay. Okay. I don't know who wants to go first, Stefan or Vincent.
Sure, I can go first. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, Eben, thank you for the talk, an excellent talk. And it's actually the talk is quite different from the book because you put more emphasis on the artwork. So in the book, I just read it, and it's my impressions. I'm kind of surprised by how readable that book is, because I know as an cultural anthropologist, you are totally capable of writing both books. So I read the book, so it's kind of I just diverted the topic a little bit because I understand that. I'm surprised that you didn't include any jargon in this book, such as post-humanism, transhumanism, multi-species ethnography. You don't include any of those people that the common people they won't understand until Donna Haraway only made her experience in the very epilogue in your book. So I'm just curious, so beautifully, so lucidly written, and the book is reviewed, I understand, by Wall Street Journal and other major mainstream publications. So my question for you is, how do you incorporate your training as an anthropologist into your writing, and without being obscure and being too academic in your writing, in your procedure, because I understand when people talking about Charles Dickens, and there's one criticism, not criticism, you can say it's a praise, that you will see Charles Dickens he always make something unnecessary prominent in his writing. So I remember I read your books. I totally remember there's one you actually visit Dr. He's home village, right? And you knock at their door and you look into their garden, the courtyard, and you saw a chicken, and the chicken was looking at you, right? Totally remember that. So how do you decide what kind of those kind of I would call unnecessary or necessary details, including a book that made the book kind of beautiful? I'm just curious because it's about art as well. Yeah.
So thank you for that question. And, I think it goes back to my training at Santa Cruz under Haraway and others. And, we were taught to do the theory, but also I would point to Susan Harding, who taught my ethnographic methods class. She encouraged us to think about ways of embedding theory in ethnographic narratives. So, the chicken looking back at me is maybe one moment where my multi-species sensibilities come back, where to try to give people a sense of the state of disrepair and abandon, but also, flourishing of a different, ecological temporality. It's not the disruptive temporality of Shenzhen speed we have in this village, but we have, an agrarian community that's seen a history very recent. Dr. He was born into that village at a moment when it didn't have electricity, when there were no roads, when there was no telephones. And, trying to account for these multiple temporalities that are coexisting in China. So, with the money that Dr. He was able to get from his university salary and investments, he was able to buy his parents a condo in the city. So, his aunties are there, his uncles are there. The cousins have all left, though. The village is a hollow village that's only occupied by elders. So it's kind of a space of nostalgic longing, I think, for many, but also a space of displaced hopes that are oriented elsewhere, hopes for a present that might be unchanging in this particular locale, but also hopes for a future generation that's going to produce that disruptive innovation that President Xi calls for with the China Dream speech. And in terms of storytelling and in terms of like what was included and what wasn't included, there's lots of other contextual ethnographic stuff that probably would have made it into an academic book. And I'm still finding the time to write some of this up as articles. One was a moment in Shenzhen when I'm staying in this super fancy hotel near the China's National Gene Bank. I'm looking out over fish farms and just sort of curious about what's going on right next door to this place. So the Gene Bank wants to sequence every form of life on Earth, not a small ambition, right? In addition to collecting the DNA of every person alive on the planet. And I wanted to get a sense of how this interfaced or not with local agrarian ecologies. So in talking to this fish farmer, I learned about the typhoon, this megastorm that had just hit Shenzhen and Hong Kong a few months before, something that none of these biotech entrepreneurs were talking about, but something that profoundly disrupted and impacted this farming economy and ecology. So he showed me the place in his room where the water was up above his head. And I asked to use the bathroom during the interview, and he embarrassingly said, "I don't have a bathroom anymore. It was destroyed by the storm." He just pointed to this pile of rubble. I also heard about the complicated histories of land tenure, the incredible debt that he was in, and the condos that were coming very soon to totally undermine this local agroecological system. So very soon, the employees of the gene bank and the nearby nuclear power plant were going to be living in picturesque villas on this place where he'd been farming fish. So yeah, I think there's in weaving together complicated stories. I'm also very much still deploying advice that Sarah Franklin taught me. She was the peer reviewer of emergent ecologies, and she recently launched the UK edition of the Mutant Project. And I think throughout my work, I've tended to make big jumps geographically, topically. And in emergent ecologies, she really encouraged me to sort of amp up the jump before I take it. So you know, in this book, I'm visiting San Francisco, Philadelphia, Hong Kong, London, you know, Jakarta, Indonesia. And, you know, sometimes these jumps are disruptive. And, you know, in the beginning of the book, I promise a mosaic portrait of this complicated moving totality. So I'm glad to hear it's readable. I'm glad to hear you didn't get lost on the jumps. But yeah, I think going back to sort of the core of your question, it's about not letting the ideas disappear, not letting the critical sensibilities disappear, but figuring out how to embed them in a narrative that does flow more easily, that isn't cluttered with the jargon. That and in many ways, I tried to write a book that also, you know, it's not just CRISPR that I'm getting inside of here, but it's emergent forms of immunology. So like the CAR T cell experiment that I characterize, the first CRISPR clinical trial in the US, like the CRISPR is the least interesting part of the story. It's also HIV biology, virology, you know, all these complicated topics. So at a certain point, I had sticky notes on my wall and was moving around different sections and just trying to figure out, okay, before a reader tries to understand HIV, let's maybe try to understand immunology with the CAR T cell therapy, and then we can do HIV. And so it's just a very complicated sequencing project just to sort of do the work of timed release, you know, these little bits of information that the reader needs to get from beginning to end.
Thank you very much. And do you see a movie coming out of this book?
Actually, I am talking to Hollywood, so I've had a number of conversations with Hollywood.
That's great. I think we should give the mic to Vincent now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My comments today are going to echo a little bit of Elizabeth's comments about the role of the historian in thinking about the past and also thinking about the future. First of all, I want to say thank you for this fascinating talk. As I was reading parts of the book and listening to you speak, I knew the question of eugenics was going to pop up. I mean, inevitably we're talking about CRISPR, so I mean it's one of the topics that has to come up. And as a historian of eugenics, I was kind of scratching my head and trying to think, you know, we're often confronted with those modern technologies and how they relate to the history of eugenics and what kind of lessons we can take from the past to think about our present and also to think about our future. Some of the parallels when I think about the modern world, like what's happening today in terms of genetics and like the rise of eugenics in the late 19th, early 20th century, has to do with its entanglement with the history of medicine. And how when you get to the late 19th century, there's this sense that, you know, we can diagnose a lot of stuff, but we can't actually cure them. And I see those kinds of parallels. For example, you talked about the Human Genome Project, and for a certain period of time, we realized that we can identify what gene is responsible for certain things, and we can diagnose a lot of these things, but we can't actually cure a lot of them. And I see this kind of parallel between early 20th century thinking about medicine and the emergence of eugenics and the current situation we find ourselves in now, where like CRISPR fits in as this kind of like therapeutic breakthrough, or however you want to talk about it, to issues that come from this kind of like therapeutic nihilism. And to me, I'm kind of thinking of in terms of like medical genetics in its role in like the hope that we have of one day eradicating disease, and how is this related to eugenics in very complex ways. Something that I found interesting in your talk was this conversation about AIDS being transmissible, like between parents and also to children. And that to me echoes early conversations in the 20th century about the transmissibility of syphilis from parent to offspring, right? Which eventually became one of the questions that like French eugenicists wanted to address. And I'm kind of like drawing these parallels. I guess the big question that comes out of this is that, like, as a historian of eugenics, we see this complexity of the history of eugenics that manifests itself across national borders, across cultural groups, across periods, across time. You know, like eugenics ends up being this tremendously complex history, and I'm wondering. If this story we see here, what kinds of like continuities and discontinuities we have between this story here and the wider history of eugenics. For example, in the Chinese context, where the experience of eugenics is sensibly different from what we see, for example, in North America. And I'm wondering if we're not like imposing some kind of trajectory of the history of eugenics when looking at these issues, and like what's really different and continuous or discontinuous in the Chinese context when we discuss these issues of gene editing or CRISPR technology.
Yeah, so for starters, eugenics is a very hotly contested translation term in China for a state-sanctioned practice. And I'm going to butcher this, and Fan can probably help me out here, but it's basically Yaoxing, I think, sort of high quality is maybe another rendering of this. And, you know, there have been doctoral dissertations written about this, and I point to Aya Wahlberg's book called Good Quality, which is about sperm banks in China as one excellent source for understanding the specificity of thinking about quality and reproduction in the Chinese context. So, you know, some will translate this state-backed project as an ongoing, explicit attempt to improve population quality by sort of managing genes and eliminating so-called defective or low quality persons or genes from the gene pool. There was a remarkable moment at the end of my first visit to China's National Gen Bank, a facility that has pioneered these prenatal testing technologies that are identifying Down syndrome and other conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, something that identifies XXY, so basically produces an androgynous boy who grows to be tall and lanky, and basically, you know, a trans body, a non-gender conforming body. And, you know, the question becomes what kinds of, again, what kinds of bodies and people are normal and abnormal. But the concluding ceremonies of this massive international conference on genomics and genetics featured an employee of the gene bank who had Down syndrome, someone who was doing technical work, who was an accomplished drummer, a table tennis player, and you know, really pointed to a complicated normative landscape there that isn't just simply, you know, targeting any anomaly for elimination. So similar sorts of conversations are happening in China about disability and disability futures. I really want to point to one key Canadian eugenic thinker who I profile in the book, Gregor Wolbrang. So Gregor is a biochemist and also a theorist of disability. And his body looks really different than the rest of ours. You know, his mother took thalidomide when she was pregnant. So his hands and legs are very different from our own. And he's very quick to insist when anyone asks, about his condition. He's insisting that he's happy and that his body made him who he is. It made him interested in biochemistry. It also made him profoundly critical, not of the scientific error that sort of resulted, or the medical product that resulted in his body looking this way, but the ongoing disabling treatment by people in society. So one of the core questions that I explore in the book, in conversation with Gregor, in conversation with Alison Kafier, whose book Queer, Feminist, and Crip invites us to choose disabled futures, is whose lives are worth living, who should be edited out of existence, and kind of who has the decision-making power to make these calls. Are these things that, as Raina Rapp describes in her book on amniocentesis, certain kinds of decisions are embedded in the affordances of the technologies themselves. So as new diagnostic techniques come online, certain preordained conclusions are promoted by clinicians and other members of the biomedical establishment. So how to sort of intensify the conflict and celebrate the conflict between members of the disabled community and members of the medical community, a profound conflict over what constitutes medical abnormality or a medical condition. So, for example, the deaf community is really pushing back and saying, we want to choose to have babies that are like us. That this is a part of the human experience that we want to see replicated into the future. So, I think current discussions are about, can I selectively abort or implant a hearing or non-hearing baby? But in the near future, we could see, could CRISPR be used to ethically take a baby that would otherwise be hearing and make it not hearing? So, all kinds of different choices are being afforded by these emergent technologies. And I think resting the sort of power to make consequential decisions about life and death and whose life is worth living, that power needs to be wrestled away from sort of a medical canon that presumes to only know about what a good life is.
Thank you. That was really insightful.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I just, when we were talking about Gregor, I immediately thought for those people who are interested, there's a fabulous documentary called Fixed. And I believe that those people who are at the University of Toronto can actually see it because I ordered it for my class. But I also believe that it might be possible to get it elsewhere. And I would be surprised if it wasn't in a public library because it's really good. And he actually makes that so when I was reading your book, I also watched the documentary, and he's making the same argument, and I was really invigorated by his saying, especially because he's really what an extraordinary person. Anyway, but besides that, so I have received some questions on my email. So I'm gonna read the question, and then there's also some question already in the chat. So we are opening the floor right now, and I'm gonna read the first question, which is, what institution would have the final say about gene editing?
Which institution will have the final say about gene editing?
Yeah, who or what institution?
Well, I don't think there's a singular answer to that. I mean, the WHO has come up with some guidelines. Some countries have signed a treaty calling for a moratorium on germline genome editing. But I think what we're seeing globally is a very patchy and heterogeneous landscape. In some cases, and I've seen IVF clinics in Cyprus, for example, advertising CRISPR babies. If at least as of about a year ago, if you typed in CRISPR babies into a computer, that that would land you on this fertility clinic in Cyprus. And so for starters, the technology is widely accessible. So IVF clinics are global right now. And there's some legal environments where there basically are no rules. There's very permissive legal environments. The US is among them. The US is among the more permissive. I would also look to countries like Israel and Egypt for having more of the permissive, and in the case of Israel, very proactive projects aimed, sort of state-backed projects in Israel aimed at both sort of looking at the genomes of parents and introducing new reproductive technologies. So I think, in some countries there are laws being passed, and I think Dr. Hu's misadventures have catalyzed some legislative action. So yeah, but I think for certain enterprising individuals, and in the book I named Zhang of New Hope Fertility Clinic in Manhattan, one of Dr. Hu's partners who visited the Hainan province with him, that visited Bangkok with him, that introduced him to some high-level officials in Beijing. Someone like Zhang is working across borders, and he's already gotten a slap on the wrist for making so-called 3-parent babies in Mexico using mitochondrial transfer technologies. He also operates clinics in the Ukraine. So I think, looking at a given issue, say climate change that has a global impact, it's very difficult to get binding international laws that govern a particular space. So, in some instances, these choices are being left to assemblages of capital and technology and that are finding homes in permissive legal environments. But yeah, some countries, Australia among them, India among them, are making very clear legislative lines saying that's not going to be done here.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions here in the chat. So there was one early question about Jill is wondering if it is now possible for genetic engineers to edit the biological clock of the fetus to determine how long the nature life and or reproductive life of this human would be. I don't know if is there an answer to that?
Well, there's definitely the aspiration. So at that gene bank that I talked about near Shenzhen, China, you go into the entrance and there's a woolly mammoth there, and you're introduced to George Church's vision of Harvard of reanimating extinct species. And there's a vision of immortality that's being offered at the bank. And the employees talk about it. They're encouraged to give biological samples of themselves to their employer with the condition that they can be subjects of research. And when you really push at what immortality in this context means, it means giving your DNA to this bank and having it stored in ones and zeros in a database. So if it's slightly different from engineering a biological clock of the fetus, but it's a long way. I also profile a particularly tragic dream of immortality that played out in the biohacker community. A young man named Aaron Trawick told me when I interviewed him that was his goal. And by the end of that chapter, he ends up dead face down in a flotation tank. And I'll just maybe leave that story there.
Yeah. So there's a lot here. Okay, so let me just roll up because the chat is just going down like this. So there's a question about the biopolitical regime shift that CRISPR technology may introduce. In relation to media scholar Thierry Bardini and Roberto Esposito, for instance, if possible, I can also pose the question orally. Okay, this is Marie. So, do you need some explanation or?
That'd be great.
Okay, Marie, can you unmute yourself and?
Hello,
If
hi.
she's still, yes,
Yeah,
great.
Thank you for taking my questions in consideration. Yes, thank you for the talk, and it's a very interesting topic, and I haven't read the book yet, so maybe my question actually comes up in the book. So there's I was relating to these people because they also do talk about eugenics and about gene editing as well, and the question comes actually first by the notion of editing that you question and that you dislike, and then I also feel that way. But it's also interesting to think about the way that this notion also implies the concept of information, let's say. And so in relation to that, I was interested in how there are kind of three different regimes of information at play. There's like the digital regime of CRISPR. There's also like the biological information at play when talking about genes, and the tension between the US and China and information war. So I had those different threads coming up, and I don't know if this is something that you talk about or not at all, and if not, then just like we can just ask another question. It's fine. But like concisely, the question was about how this I tend to the genetic turn is actually proposing a different kind of regime, biopolitical regime shift. So this talk, for example, of genetic capitalism, is it something that you talk about or not at all?
Yeah, so these are very old ideas. If you go back and read Jackson from 1983, you see already the genetic turn and the speculation and the hope and the hype you have 20 odd years before the genome is unveiled by Bill Clinton. And if you go back to Foucault's original formulation of biopolitics as an emergent mode of governmentality. So previously you try to kill the king, you get dismembered in the public square. Increasingly, instead of the overt violence of sovereignty, you get a mode of governance that is about promoting life, the art of making live and letting die. And I think what we're seeing, since say like the 1980s, when Jackson is first coming up with those initial ideas about biocapitalism that later get elaborated by people like Sarah Franklin, Stefan Helmreich, Donna Haraway, Kaushik Sundararajan, under the sign of biocapitalism, biopolitics becomes deterritorialized. It's no longer sort of a sovereign production, but is maybe sort of a co-production between desiring patients, desiring subjects of a particular form of optimized life and futurity, and the technologists and the entrepreneurs and the investors who in part are trying to accumulate capital, but are also engaged in these sort of speculative futures that are taking the economy outside of the domain of production, but transforming it more into that purely speculative space where it's the dreaming that is attracting the most intense levels of capital investment. So I think what we've seen is, just specifically on eugenics, is a shift in sort of state-sponsored eugenics to more consumer-driven eugenics, where kind of the biopolitical norms get internalized by patients and parents and these desiring subjects. So I think these shifts are happening, but I would put the kind of pin at the shift at a much earlier moment than CRISPR, and try to point to this broad suite of other allied technologies that are doing some similar work.
Yeah, and to add to this, I was scrolling down the chat, and I saw Francois' observation. WHO has not issued guidelines, so this goes into this direction, definitely. WHO will submit its final report on human genome editing to the Director General later this year, so probably second quarter. She also wrote Françoise Baylis. She also like you probably know her work, but she came to our salon last year, and we had another great discussion about gene editing. And so she wrote this article. So like you can actually go and I think is I don't know if it is free downloadable, but anyway, I can make people, like I can let people access it in case. So other questions, there were other
maybe
questions.
just on that, I just wanted to say, Francois, I'm really honored that you're here, and I'm a big fan of your work. So it's great to be in dialogue. And I'm also waiting for the WHO report, but also, I bring to this project sort of 10 years of policy experience. I was doing human rights advocacy related to the ongoing genocide in West Papua. And I guess I bring a profound pessimism in the particular ways that legislative assemblies respond to or fail to respond to international bodies like the WHO. I think in the US, we've seen the US legislative environment is the one that I'm most familiar with. And we've seen failed resolutions introduced, sort of recognizing these ongoing efforts by the national academies and the WHO. But as I chronicle in the book, as democratic deliberations are happening at these summits, we have high-powered lobbyists in real time actually writing the laws. I followed a guy from sort of the microphone of the first summit out into the hall, where he was furiously working on his laptop. He put up his hand like, wait. And I later had a detailed conversation with him, and learned that he's responsible for basically shaping the legislative landscape on this issue, representing upwards of 280 companies. And so I think the ways that power is functioning predictably within these national parliamentary assemblages makes me a little pessimistic that any kind of considered international deliberations by the WHO, by the national academies or others is going to result in some kind of universal policy framework that is going to govern this technology.
Yeah, unfortunately. There's other questions about, so one interesting thing that came out also here is like, somebody, Louise asks if you have encountered intersections or overlaps between at-home DNA testing companies like Ancestry and 23andMe and your research, and how non-academic audiences react to your work.
Yeah, so for the first, the gene bank that I keep mentioning in Shenzhen is doing very similar things as 23andMe for Chinese consumers, and they're also offering things like sports tests that you buy a little box. Forget how much it was, but it was there was a vending machine that was selling different genetic products in the gene bank, and the sports test was the most expensive thing in the vending machine. Yes, there's similar sorts of things happening, and if you don't read the fine print with some of these, your DNA goes into a database, and that relates to one of these later questions, I guess also by Eloise, related to DNA discrimination, surveillance, privacy, and biopolitics. So if you get a prenatal diagnostic test from BGI as the mother, your genome also gets collected into the largest whole genome database operated in the world. BGI is linked to FGI, Forensic Genomics International, and has a relationship and contracts with the Chinese government. In the US, as probably much better than me, Ancestry and 23andMe and other sites are being used by the FBI and the NYPD to identify relatives of suspects as well as suspects. So, basically the whole population has been collected right now in the US and in other places where these novelty technologies have produced Christmas gifts. One of my favorite 23andMe anecdotes is, it's kind it's not a happy favorite, but it's one of the ones that I like to tell is how 23andMe often produces divorce rather than some kind of startling insights about your colorful ancestry when it reveals evidence of dad's infidelity from a couple decades ago when a half-brother shows up in the family tree. So yeah, these testing technologies have all kinds of unintended consequences, and the security state in the US and Australia and China, I'm sure many other parts of the world, is actively trying to use this, as well as, insurance companies and employers, so BGI also offers health insurance plans to their employees. And you can imagine, all as sort of surveillance capitalism and data capitalism are blossoming in the current era. Actually, in the words of an FBI agent who I quote in a forthcoming paper in Current Anthropology, like the data is being collected now to integrate all this in the future. So soon we're going to be seeing smartwatches integrated with your medical records, integrated with your DNA, integrated with your, performance at work. So this is what the FBI is envisioning in the near future, and entrepreneurs and investors are also betting on those futures, in effect, bringing them closer to reality.
Yeah, plus the collection of all our facial profiles that are made by all sorts of cameras and collected by various companies.
Actively being collected right now.
Yeah, exactly. So there's still a couple of more questions, and then I don't know, maybe we should wind down a little bit, because I think we put you on the spot quite a bit. But Carissa is curious about your thoughts, what your thoughts are, if any, on Walter Jacobson's new book, Codebreaker. It seems to be diametrically opposed to your position in terms of how it is lacking critically. I think your book brings a much needed and fresh look onto how we are narrativizing the gene. I haven't read Codebreaker. I meant to, so maybe I should not.
I actually, to be honest, haven't read it either, and I think it's because I kind of sense that it is this sort of gene boosterism and fueled by this speculative economy of hope and hype. And one of the things I really tried to do in the book is deflate the gene. As much as I'm trying to get inside of what CRISPR can do, and I'm inside of all these spaces of genomics, I'm questioning the so-called dogma. Where a gene is translated into protein, is translated into a phenotypic observable trait. We know that biologies in the plural are way more complicated than the biology of genetics. So Hannah Landecker and many others have talked about the importance of epigenetics. The microbiome is incredibly influential in terms of making us who and what we are, dynamically responding to our corporeal states and actively changing our metabolism. And now my new project is on the virome. It turns out that about half of our genome is not chimpanzee in origin. Chimpanzee in origin is also the wrong thing. John Mark's book, 98% Chimpanzee, is kind of the definitive biological anthropology account of our shared ancestry. But we have a lot of genetic elements from viruses. So in thinking about the gene, I think we also have to think about, the noisy jumping genes of viruses. We have to think about the ways that genes are methylated and unpacked selectively, that are sort of on and off switches that say whether or not a gene can be transcribed or not. But I think we also have to resist the tendency to molecularize really complicated things, like how do you and smart scholars like Tony Hatch are doing this, right? So he's looking at intergenerational legacies of racism and how those are leaving molecular signatures in terms of metabolic diseases and creating vulnerabilities to pandemics like SARS-CoV-2. So some people are doing that smart work of looking at how things like racism, discrimination, inequality get translated into molecular markers. But I think we also need to refuse these genetic logics and yeah, remember this long legacy that we inherit as scholars in the humanities and social sciences for thinking about power, culture, and history in different kinds of idioms.
I think so we have one more question. I think we should conclude with this one. Do you see human genetic editing and technologies to be a positive force in society? This is Spencer. Obviously, there are many risks and areas for exploiting in genetic editing. Additionally, humanity has a history of using new technologies to commit atrocious things. I agree. I'm wondering, with everything you have seen and learned, if you see this to be a technology that is overall positive or can be.
So I wouldn't try to draw absolutes. So I'm remembering.
It's like a $1 million question.
Yeah, right. So I'm thinking with my friends in the ACT UP movement here, and I'm also thinking with Alondra Nelson, who was my mentor at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, and who's now in the Biden administration's White House as a director of science and technology policy. Yeah, it's like, yay. Like, yes. I was really skeptical of the Biden administration until I saw some of these appointments. So Alondra's book, The Social Life of DNA, is sort of a counterpoint to some of the conversations about eugenics, to think about ways that a social movement, in particular, the African-American struggle for reparations for slavery, was aided and abetted by emergent genetic technologies. So Alondra describes how some Black American activists used genetic tests to get standing in courtrooms where insurance companies like Aetna had made heaps of profit off of the unpaid labor of their ancestors. So these genetic tests were being used in creative ways to try to get legal standing. I mean, she chronicles how that particular court case didn't result in a settlement. The struggle for reparations is ongoing, and I think you can look to series like HBO's Watchmen to think about, interesting creative ways that we can imagine genetic technologies playing a role in social justice movements in the future. But in addition to that Black American experience, you see genetic technologies being used for all kinds of remarkable forensic projects on the US-Mexico border, for example, where the disappeared who cross through the desert, who find a way around or under the border wall and get lost in the desert or starve to death or experience hypothermia. Genetic technologies are enabling relatives and loved ones to obtain some sort of closure about their missing loved ones who they don't know if they're being held in conditions of sexual slavery or what, or if they've passed away. So in the book and in my thinking, I always want to be interested and open to the sorts of appropriations of technology that Donna Haraway pointed us towards in 1985. In the Cyborg Manifesto, she, very clearly laid out, the internet, I guess maybe this is even before the internet, but, the internet's a product of militarism, right? It's a DARPA project. A lot of the early computing technologies are also military technologies, products of capital optimization. But how can we appropriate these tools for different kinds of uses? So, the ACT UP movement has been really effective in not only showing the promise of liberating themselves from this chronic disease, but also, how might we make this technology affordable? And how might we, as the technology becomes available, think about diversity and inclusion, even as we design the clinical trials? So yeah, I wouldn't want to come away from this conversation with you thinking that I'm a technophobe, but I think, we've got to be critical and maybe I should read Isaacson's book, but my sense is that, some of those core issues that I care about are missing.
Yeah, definitely. There is no straightforward answer, but there is no straightforward answer for any of the issues that have emerged from this type of research. And especially today, there's too much diversity and too many variables that are intervening in changing things around. Anyway, so I think that we are to the end of the evening. Well, Spencer and Cheryl and Eloise and everybody else is thanking you right now. But yeah, thank you so much for your very generous responses. We put you on the spot a lot. And also thanks to Elizabeth, Fan, and Vincent for asking these questions and to get the discussion started. So yeah, I hope you have a good day, since for you it's the beginning of the day. Yeah, and for us it's night, as you see, there's only my lamp that is lighting me. So yeah, thank you so much again. And
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for hosting, Roberta. Thank you, Fan.
Oh, that's very great. Thank you so much.
So many others.
Round of applause. You can't hear it, but we are applauding actually.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Right, bye.
Thank you again for joining us. Thanks. Okay, I'm finishing it here.